Okay, all right. So, welcome everyone. Hopefully, folks are starting to come on in. So, welcome to the first online peace science colloquia of this academic year. I'm Chelsea Estancona. I'm an assistant professor at the University of South Carolina, and I'm one of the co-organizers for this year, along with Brad Smith, who is an assistant professor at Vanderbilt University. So the online peace science colloquia began in 2015. So we've had actually quite a long period of being able to do this with folks, which has been even better, as one of our discussants was just mentioning during COVID. So we're glad to be able to continue this. And this is just designed to celebrate the really excellent research that we see from our community, both before and after the annual meeting of the Peace Science Society, and to really engage with a wider community online. I'll drop some links related to the OPSC into the chat for those who would like to engage with us on Twitter or on the website, et cetera, et cetera. And so today we have a really fantastic paper. I'm super excited about this. Let me go ahead and introduce our paper and our authors. The title of the paper is Contentious Politics in the Borderlands, Migrant Characteristics, Tactics, and Public Support. And it is co-authored by Pearce Edwards, who is a postdoctoral fellow at Carnegie Mellon University, and Daniel Arnon, who is an assistant professor at the University of Arizona. We also have three fantastic discussants here this morning. So we have Toby Heinrich from the University of South Carolina, Tamar from Columbia University, and Matthew Wright from the University of British Columbia. Just to let the audience know a little bit about how we will proceed today. So y'all are invited and welcomed to leave comments or questions in the chat, and I will do my best to monitor those and sort of add them in at the conclusion of discussants' comments. If it makes sense kind of in the flow of discussion, I may try to incorporate them at that time as well. We will also save all comments and questions in the chat so that our participants are able to look at this later. So don't hesitate to put something in there, even if we don't have time to address that within the hour. So the author is going to present for 15 minutes, and then I'll turn it over to our discussants. So I'm going to go ahead and let our two co-authors begin screen sharing, and we'll get started.
Daniel, I think you're muted if you're going.
Sorry about that. I'm on a new setup with multiple screens that didn't that I couldn't remember how to actually start this properly. My apologies. So hi everybody. I'm Daniel Arnon. I'm going to be presenting the work. Thank you for that lovely introduction. So our paper today is titled Contentious Politics in the Borderlands. And obviously my co-author Pearce is at Carnegie Mellon, and he is also on the market. So the starting point for us on this paper really comes from the various forms of interactions that we're seeing between migrants and the U.S. Border Patrol along the borderlands between U.S. and Mexico. And what really started off this project for us in many ways was one of the events that happened at the border that you see in front of you, where Haitian asylum seekers were confronted quite aggressively by U.S. Border Patrol. It made media and people were commenting about this event in all sorts of ways, and there was obviously a politicized set of response to this set of interactions between the Haitian asylum seekers and the U.S. Border Patrol. But more broadly, this represents one endpoint of a broader set of interactions that are really starting to occur, that have been occurring in the border between Mexico and the U.S., where different forms of interactions have occurring. So here we have a different group of Central American asylum seekers who set up an encampment along the border, right? And so the variation in the terms of encounters really drove us to ask a set of questions regarding how people perceive these set of contentious actions that are happening at the border between migrants and the border agents, and how that impacts their public support for policies regarding migrants and migration more broadly. So that's really our starting point for this paper. And we're going to be asking two main set of questions. The first is how migrants' characteristics matter. So things that they are less able to make difference and changes to, areas that they have less control over, right? And we're going to be examining whether the identity of the migrant is going to matter, and whether the claims that they're coming with, whether they're coming from an economic or political claim-making state of the world, is going to matter for the public's perception and support for policy specifically regarding migrants. And the second question that we're going to ask from the world of contentious politics is do their tactics matter? Does how they engage and interact with the border agents matter for the public's perceptions of them as migrants? And so just to give you a quick preview of the results, we use a large survey on both US and Mexican respondents, and we end up finding that migrant nonviolent resistance compared to confrontations. And so in the tactics treatment arm, we find that it decreases support for deportation and increases beliefs that migrants make a positive contribution to society. When we look, and then when we start looking within the different within the other set of differences, we see that these results hold regardless of our other treatment variables of migrant ethnicity and the type of claim, and the results hold also regardless of the party and the proximity to the border of the respondents. And these results hold on both sides of the border, so both in the US and in Mexico, amongst the large set of respondents that we have from there. And so just to go over what I'm going to be doing for the rest of the presentation briefly, so I'll give you an outline of the literature that we're drawing from and the theory that we're trying to build with regard to contentious politics in Borderlands. I'll show you a little bit of the research design and our estimation strategy. I'll show you some main results in heterogeneity, and we'll briefly conclude. And so I think that for us, the starting point of this project is really trying to rethink about the class of migrants as a set of contentious actors, right? And we've seen this phenomenon really growing, right? Where migrants are trying to cross borders, and in the process of their migration, in whatever form that takes, they have become political targets in their destination countries, primarily. And so that's one component of the process. But what we really started to notice is that as this phenomenon was growing and increasing in caliber, we were starting to see that migrants are starting to create for themselves a set of identities around the migration process itself, creating a claim-making activity and de facto turning them into a set or a distinct set of contentious actors, or what McAdam, Terrell, and Tilly call transgressive contention. And so that was really the foundation for us, is to recognize these actors as a set of contentious actors that are forging their own set of identities in the process of performing the act of migration, and having both push factors that are driving them out, but also push factors externally as they become political targets in the destination countries that they arrive at. And so we're going to really bring the lens of contentious politics into this area of migration. And so when we start to dig into how these things might affect the perceptions of respondents or the public more broadly in either transit or destination countries, right? The first thing that we were really thinking about is the claim that they were making. And so migrants who are facing political persecution, right, are deemed to be of a different class to certain publics, right? And so people who are facing political persecution may be perceived more favorably because the reason that is driving them to migrate is really persecution in their home country, right? And as a result of their selection to the destination country, there's also some kind of mechanism that may be at work of some kind of civic compatibility between the migrant and the destination country. And so there might be some kind of conditional support based on the nature of the claim making in the migration process on whether it's driven by an economic or a political claim. And so this leads us to our first set of hypotheses. where we distinguish between destination and transit countries, because here the claim making is going to be really important for us to see whether there's any kind of distinction to be made in a destination versus a transit country. But in both of them, in the destination country, we would expect that claims that are based on a political claim are going to increase support for migration and decrease support for exclusion, right? Because of that sense of compatibility and it being a destination country. Whereas in transit countries, we might expect this to not make that much of a difference because they're just passing through, but it's not their final destination. And so they might not view the migrants as a more permanent set of individuals who are going to integrate themselves into the country. And so the claim making itself may not matter as much, or at least that was our starting point for the hypothesis. Regarding identity, so as well, we're thinking within the tendency to racialize ethnic outgroups and trigger some sort of perception of a cultural threat based on the ethnic identity of the migrants. And so here we're also thinking that in both transit and destination countries, the ethnicity of the migrant being a more or less outgroup of the broad public is going to lead again to increase in support for migration, decrease support for exclusion of migrants more broadly. And then the last component that we were trying to hypothesize about was the set of tactics that are used in the engagements between the migrants and the border agents. And so again, within the world of contentious politics, right, physical threat is going to decrease public support, or tactics that could lead to harm, thus activating the fears of violence and crime as motivators for decreasing support for migration and increasing support for the exclusion of the migrant actors. And so we're essentially hypothesizing that nonviolent resistance, because of its characteristic of lowering the moral barriers to support, is going to increase support for migration policies and decrease support for exclusive policies at the border. And so to test the hypothesis, we run a survey experiment on both US and Mexico, using the distinction of a destination versus a transit country, kind of allowing us to disentangle a little bit more of the mechanisms and perceptions of migration. And this is a great case to kind of select on, because immigration is a salient issue on both sides of the border, with a set of shown partisan divisions over the contestation of framing on how to be thinking about migrants amongst the media line of the representation of migration amongst the public. And so that's where we start off. We run a survey experiment with a representative sample on age and gender for roughly 4,000 people in the US and in Mexico. And one of the questions that we were really curious about is whether proximity to the border is going to matter. So we block sampled 30% of the sample to be on border states. And then we were also able to geolocate the respondent's location and do it in a different way. But we know that we have a larger sample within the border states to kind of get at the interesting set of variation that exists at who is more proximate to the case of migration versus those who are further away from it. We fielded it just this summer in July and in August using Lucid, and we have a set of pre-treatment questions, including demographics, media consumption, salience of migration, and safety from crime and personal sense of safety of the respondents. And so the way that we do it is with a set of labeled treatments. And so broadly, the respondents get a news vignette with information about a fictionalized but very plausible, very realistic set of contentious border events at the US-Mexico border based in Texas. And then in a 2x2x2 set of survey experiments, we vary each of the treatment arms on claim, identity, and tactics. And so in claim, we're going to be looking at an economic versus a political claim as the driver of migration. We're looking at two identities, so we're looking at Central American versus Haitian, and that it easily falls into the category of race within American politics. And so we're trying to look for that sense and both in the US and in Mexico. The set of tactics vary between a set of confrontations between the migrants and the border agents versus an encampment, which is a clear world of nonviolent resistance. And so here's just an easy way to kind of think of this 2 by 2 by 2. Here it's in the form of a 2 by 4. But the set of treatments are primarily the tactics, whether a confrontation or encampment, and then each one of the claim making versus ethnic identity and origin of the migrants. And so our two main DVs that we're going to be showing you today are support for migration, and the question specifically asks, on a scale from 1 to 5, do you think that migrants make a positive contribution to society? For our negatively framed DV, we're thinking about exclusionary migration policies. And so on a 1 to 5 scale, we ask the migrants who cross the border illegally should be sent back to their homes. So in sense, we're asking about support for deportation as the exclusive policies at hand. And so what we're trying to get at is the ATE, the average treatment effect for each of the treatment arms. And we use difference in means and regression. We have a set of 3 primary treatment variables and a set of covariates and a robust error term. So what do we find, right? So I think that here, this is where we were pleasantly surprised, I would say, from perhaps a normative perspective on what it is that we found. So in terms of migrant tactics, looking at panel B, right, what we're seeing is that a change in tactics from violent to nonviolent increases support for the proposition that migrants contribute broadly to society and decreases support for a policy that supports deportation. So in this case, we're really seeing that nonviolence, the tactic, matters a lot to the public in terms of their perceptions of migrants. When we look at the characteristics, right, either the political claims or their ethnicity, we actually find no real difference in the public's perceptions of the migrants' characteristic on both claims and on support. And so this is in the US survey. In the Mexico survey, the results look almost identical. They're a little smaller in magnitude, but in terms of the directionality and the substantively, right, we see the same set of increasing support for 3 minutes. Okay. Increasing support for contribution, decreasing support for deportation, and a broad no change in terms of political claims and ethnic identity. We look at it in a set of treatment by treatment variations. And so when we're looking at the nonviolent treatment, we really don't see any big differences in the two conditions between the ethnic identity of the migrants, whether they are from Central America or from Haiti, in both of the DVs, both in Mexico and the US. And so we started to explore a set of heterogeneity, looking specifically at partisanship and proximity. We also have a slew of other things that we're not going to be showing you here today, but we're happy to discuss in the Q&A if you have any more questions. But when we're looking at the interaction between tactic treatment and partisanship or proximity as either a binary being in the border state or in distance to the closest border crossing, we really see no consistent evidence that nonviolence, that the effect of nonviolence varies by either partisanship or proximity. We look at a mechanism test about the drivers being criminality. Here we do see one main difference between the US and Mexico, where in Mexican respondents see no significant change in migrant criminality when they use nonviolence, whereas in the US they ascribe, they're less likely to ascribe criminal intent to the migrants who are using in our treatment condition a nonviolent resistance tactic. And so broadly, I think that what we're showing here, and this is where I think it's really interesting, is that migrants can actually win public support through the set of tactics that they're using, right? And again, it's less about at least in our set of findings, it's less about the claims that they're making and their ethnic identity, and it's more about how they are interacting with the border agents. So I think that there's something really neat, and for those who are interested in promoting nonviolence, I think that there's something normatively appealing about this result, which we honestly were not necessarily expecting. But it really was a kind of a pleasant surprise from a more normative perspective. But it is what it is. And again, like there's no main distinction between transit and destination countries in terms of public opinion regarding these set of actors within this context. Though the mechanism through which the same result comes to fruition may be a little bit different in the two different cases. And again, just the notion that claims and identity are less critical than tactics is something that we can ascribe to policymakers and to the set of actors who are supporting migrants in their actions. There's something here that can be applied in a way because we're able to observe this, but not the other ones in terms of the static characteristics versus the actions of the migrants. And so that's it. And I'm going to stop the screen share, and I'm really looking forward to your comments. Thank you so much.
Fantastic. Thank you, Daniel and Pearce. If I could ask y'all to just really briefly give us sort of what goals you'd like to focus on, or what questions you'd like the discussants to focus on, just a really brief rundown.
Daniel, do you mind if I jump in? Yeah, well, thank you all for agreeing to discuss. I mean, I think it's just fantastic, and thanks to Jennifer, Chelsea, and for recruiting you all. And I think what's fantastic is that you all represent some very different but related literatures that we're trying to bring into conversation in this paper. And I know we cite, I mean, Matthew, for example, I think you've done this already in some work with migration and contention. So we're just really curious to hear kind of from your own perspective, to what extent are we able to kind of meld these different insights from different literatures together. Our background is much more from the contentious politics, political violence world. So, bear that in mind, I guess, as you're thinking about how we do this well in the paper. And then, of course, just since the experiment's already completed, there's not so much we're able to do empirically, but I guess the most helpful comments would be related to, additional checks empirically, but also framing of the paper, depending on where this paper ends up going submission wise in a few months at the most. So thank you.
Great. Thanks, Pearce. Okay. Toby, would you like to start us off for discussing comments?
I can, thank you. So there's obviously lots of nice things that I could say, which I won't, because I have lots of points to focus on how to improve these things. There are lots of nice things that can be said, don't get me wrong. So the first, and I have 4 points that are like immediate, and the other one is just far in the future. And I think the 4 points that I have right now are much more on like things that just sound a little bit discordant and just holes that could be plugged, or just better justification for things you've already done. So the first thing is, so the way I'm reading his paper is using ideas from the contentious politics literature to understand migration policy, migration attitudes better. I think that's how I would think about it. What's not obvious then is, why focus on the border? Why focus on refugees? Because you're jumping a lot between refugees and migrants, at least in the framing, and they're obviously like one's a subset of the other. And why that? Why is that so interesting? Why is like settled refugees that might also experience local violence or something like that, they could start making claims? Or is it people like me? Should I just starting like, hey, I'm a German professor, I'm starting to make identity claims? Like, is that interesting? I don't think so, probably, or at least not to me. But like, you have a reason why you go there. I think make this clear. And why is it a border? Why is it refugees? Along the same lines is, I don't know that you are clear what the contentious politics angle buys you beyond the introduction of tactics. Like when I think, again, so in this, like, we have competing models about the world. Like, are you telling me, hey, here's another explanatory variable that we need to all control for? Or, which is not an exciting claim to make as a punch of the paper, or rather, are you proposing actually looking at migration politics through the lens of contentious politics is better than the IPE type studies, or sort of more American politics, pure identity-based things? Make that claim, or are you willing to make that claim? I think it would be nice to be clear about that. Okay. Does that, and then the obvious question is like, are there old findings that under your lens look different or need to have a different interpretation? Is there a new set of studies that have to come out of this? The third point is I'm a little bit unclear why you picked those outcome questions. Those are very general questions that implies, well, first of all, one thing, your results say, okay, something local, Borderlands, with a very specific circumscribed population, something happens, but that has global general attitudinal effects. I would almost say, like, either it's not motivated well enough, like, you don't have this nice interpretation, but is it how do you motivate that? Because is there, in the contentious politics world, are specific attitudes about specific groups and types of people that could be collective actors? Are those attitudes relevant, or is it general attitudes? I don't know that particular contentious literature that you're coming from all that well. I think for where I know a little bit more in the terrorism literature, I think specific things, or at least are assumed in like game theoretic models than like general, I don't like terrorism type claims. So that generates somewhat of a friction that I think you guys have to bridge in some way. And I think the other thing is, I think the deportation question actually has quite a bit of a different meaning in the US and in Mexico, right? And precisely because you are setting the vignette that takes place on the US side of the border. Like, in some sense, like, the Mexicans could say, like, what do I care? They're all in Texas, like type thing, right? Or even if you had the events take place just on the Mexican side of the Mexican-Texas border, then you could say, like, well, they just came through our entire country. The next best thing to do is just push them to the north and not, like, get them back to the south. So I think the interpretation is actually different, which gets me in a slightly uncomfortable way to the point number 4, which is, so you make the distinction between destination and transit country. And I think you're doing, in some sense, too little of that. On one side, you're not even saying you're doing that much because your hypotheses are essentially identical. And one hypothesis that has no effect is an hypothesis, which is like, okay, no effects are difficult to test for, which technically you're not testing for no effect. You're testing it's statistically insignificant, as are all the other things in exactly that column, which means it's kind of tricky actually to mean whether to show that you have a no effect or it's just noisy stuff. And that actually is kind of tricky. And so to me, it raises the question of maybe this context or the difference between Mexico and the US doesn't matter. Like, and what that actually means is that actually in the contentious politics context, it suggests this stuff doesn't matter, that people have just a gut reaction to groups making claims, almost like divorced from sort of who's being challenged here, because the results are essentially the same, yet I think the political implications are quite different from these types of answers. Again, maybe
I'm gonna ask you to wrap up in like the next minute.
That's a lot. Thank you. And so with that, I don't know how to really square that. I think maybe the heterogeneous results, I didn't fully thought through how the heterogeneous results speak to the claim that I just made, but maybe that's the way where you can sort of pull things apart. The last thing, and this is sort of the completely unfair because it goes way beyond the pre-analysis plan is, and it's bothered me about my own survey experimental work and generally is, so you guys talk about strategic actors and strategy and tactics, yet of course you guys have the luxury of just somebody flipping coins, right? And to some extent, like, which means like they are also every actor that you study is strategic. Yet you use the word strategic for elites in the media, and you always use the word tactic for the migrants or for the refugees, right? Given that there's leaders in your vignette, they're strategic too. So which of these outcomes here are completely off the equilibrium? They're interesting to explore on an attitudinal matter, but there are people that study attitudes because they care about attitudes. Other people study attitudes because they want to understand political outcomes. I kind of found the latter camp. So what I think you guys should do is you should write like a game theoretic model where where the utility is a function of public approval or something like that, and then put the public opinion estimates into the utilities and tell me what is the most likely equilibrium outcome, and then play with something like that. Because marginal effects are nice. I don't know if they materialize in reality. That said, let me tell you, there are still nice things I could say about that, but those were sort of the more engaging points that I wanted to make.
Great, thanks, Toby. Daniel and Pearce, would y'all like to respond briefly to any of that or continue on to our next discussion?
What do you think, Daniel? What's the custom? I'm happy to wait for everyone's comments.
It's sort of up to, if there's anything pressing that you wanted to clarify, I would say do it now. Otherwise, we can wait till the end for y'all to chime in with that.
Maybe we can wait and see if there what commonalities there are and be easier to respond.
Okay. All right. Tamar, go ahead. Thank you.
All right, great. Thank you both for a great presentation. I enjoyed reading the paper and I enjoyed viewing the presentation as well. Before I begin, I think my comments will hopefully kind of be used to help you kind of with the next steps with thinking about submission, like what are the strengths, what are the areas for improvement. So overall, I think thinking about this as kind of marrying two streams of literature is often kind of a fruitful thing to do, kind of with the cross-pollination between different ideas that can be related. I think it's really good, and I'm very much supportive of this effort. But because of this, as I think the angle you're trying to go with, I want to encourage you to think a bit more about what does it mean theoretically. So what can we learn from focusing on these border contestation cases? What can we learn from this example about nonviolent activism, about attitudes towards immigration? Is it just another example of theories we already kind of know about? Or is there something theoretically new here, right? So that's something that wasn't really clear to me in your framing. At times it felt like a really cool new example of theories we already know. So like we know that nonviolent activism is more likely to be supported by the public as opposed to violent activism. What about this border case is kind of giving us something new to think about. So I was trying to think myself, like where are some interesting directions. So for example, so when you think about like those two dimensions, like identity and the tactics, one of the interesting findings you find is that, in between having migrants being framed or presented as Central American versus Haitian, you don't find a large difference. And that is actually really interesting to the nonviolent activism literature, right? Because like, what is this a case of? Is it just like, because these are considered migrants and migrants are kind of under the umbrella of minorities as opposed to majorities in the public, what does it really mean to us? And or is there something more, so I think kind of talking more about those dimensions and how that case can teach us about teach us something new, I think would be really helpful. And I think you have the potential to get there. I just think you need to think more about that. Similarly with the tactics. So what was, I think, I don't know if you can do it kind of in terms of the survey, but I think what would have been really nice is if you had a control condition with no activism, like the migrants are not actually doing anything. And I think that's actually something that I think maybe could be used, you can help clarify to the reader by the framing. So in the media coverage of these events or just about migration or the border and more generally, how much of the coverage is about contentious events and how much is just about the topic? That was not clear to me. And I think that part of the interesting question here that you may be able to help us understand better is, is it just the coverage, coverage of the fact that there was some sort of event shaping the attitudes as opposed to having no event, just like something more neutral, because right now you're kind of framing it as like there is activism and it's either violent or non-violent, and I think there's something I feel like in between that is missing, especially in this case. So overall, just kind of on the theory side, I would say that I think you need to just think a bit more about how to tell us why studying this case helps us learn something we don't already know, and I feel like there is something there that you need to still develop. Two more things. Actually, one more thing, then I think that's just kind of like as an idea. So I already mentioned that I think I would like to know a bit more about just descriptive data. How much do migrants engage in these kinds of events? You know, is it something that is really frequent? Is it something that is, you know, or also how much does the media coverage these kinds of events as opposed to other types of coverage? I think you began the paper with this kind of framing or elite framing of migrants. And I think this is actually, in my mind, a more fruitful direction to frame the paper in, which is kind of like how the way we present this issue affects public opinion, which also that's my last point, also relates to you know, how much of exposure does one need to change their attitudes? I think this is kind of like on the broader side of things, right? Because you have this cool experiment, you show different attitudes right after exposure to a vignette, but how much like being exposed to one event really shapes attitudes towards immigration? And this again goes back to this like kind of linking those two literatures that I think makes it cool, but also somewhat challenging. So I think kind of thinking about that from the kind of the framing side of things and kind of describing to us a bit just descriptive data. I would love to just know how much of these events are actually taking place as opposed to other types of activities. And then thinking a bit more about the theory and what does this case can tell us about nonviolent activism in particular that we don't already know. But I do think that there is a lot of really cool stuff here, and congrats on putting this together. Yeah, I look forward to seeing the next version.
Awesome. Thank you, Tamar.
Thank you.
Okay, Matthew, go ahead.
All right. Well, thanks a lot, guys. I really appreciate the invitation and the opportunity to engage with some really interesting work. Unfortunately for you guys, this is a good study, so I actually want to engage with it. And so I have a lot to say. Some of it overlaps with what other people have said, so I'm going to try to minimize that. But let me just start by saying I wasn't really that surprised by the finding, but there's a technical reason, which is I don't think that like ethnicity doesn't really work in information-rich studies like this one, like vignettes, and I've written about that, and mainly that I think it's mostly about statistical rather than taste-based discrimination. So to the degree that stereotypes and ethnicity matter, it's informational rather than like identity related. So like I wasn't hugely surprised by it, but that's interesting. And it's still useful to know that. I wondered a little bit about the choice of migrant encampments as a good example of nonviolent contentious politics. And so I'm not in that literature, as you guys pointed out, like I'm kind of from a different place. Or as like the title of the paper has it as like tactics, right? Like so we're trading one tactic versus another. And the issue isn't that something contentious happens or doesn't happen, but the issue is that, like, for one thing, these encampments aren't, they're not really a protest strategy, or they wouldn't strike me as such, or they probably wouldn't strike most people as such. These people aren't choosing like a way of protesting, they're just trying to exist. Which isn't quite the same, conceptually speaking, as like a lunch counter sit-in or something like that, where you have a nonviolent means of actually generating contention or conversation or whatever. The other thing is, it's in every respect like uncontentious, right? So I know that contentious politics is a broad label, but I mean, like, there's no aggression, there's no resistance, they're just living there. So given that, I think it's kind of strange a little bit to pitch this as a contrast between modes of contentious politics or modes of tactics. And like what I had in mind is a kind of a better example. I mean, this is like, you know, a lot of this is in the spirit of the study you didn't do, you know, so that's, you know, it is what it is. But I thought about in 2017 when they did a Day Without Immigrants, and about how that was, to me, a kind of a better example of a nonviolent yet contentious protest strategy, right? There was a strategic attempt to sort of tell immigrants to not show up to work that day in order to teach people how important they were. So that kind of framing I found was a little bit strange. I felt like there were a couple of missed opportunities. Tamar already made this point, so I'm not going to belabor it. But I really wanted to see a contrast with like a kind of a dummy article that had nothing to do with immigration. I wanted to know, like, all right, well, you know, the whole paper is framed around like conditional on contention. How do people respond to one type of, you know, transgression versus another? And so, like, in a practical sense, you show nicely in the paper that, you know, media coverage waxes and wanes on this stuff. But I mean, I have to feel like when something like this happens, the modal person out in the world is almost certainly not going to have heard about it. So you're going to have a lot of like people that just don't know when something like this happens. But in more theoretical terms, I think there's plausibly an argument that a lot of people are fine with immigrants like this, and fine even with undocumented immigrants, as long as they keep their heads down and they don't, sort of like cause problems. I'm using scare quotes there, but like, they don't sort of like generate these kinds of instances. So and that seems to me especially likely with groups that are like undocumented immigrants, in the sense that they're not full legal citizens with all that entails. And so I think about the protests that happened in 2006. You mentioned the study that I did, feels like 100,000 years ago. That was about the 2006 protests. And, a major reaction to that was, especially on the right, it was anger. And so it seems like maybe among certain groups of people, just not having a protest at all, or not having a kind of like contentious act at all, might have been more useful. So that's one thing. Another sort of, I think, missed opportunity is that, like, and this is actually raised in the front part of the paper, is that like any given protest is framed differently by elites, right? And so the truth is that, usually protesters don't usually decide en masse to, either engage in peaceful or violent ways, right? A lot depends on how the authorities respond, and most protests mix elements of peace and violence, especially as they escalate. So what that means is that different sides of the political spectrum, as you guys say, right, are going to look at the protest and either frame it as a violent protest, or they're going to frame it as a peaceful, protest. And so it'd be interesting as a kind of a next step to look at how much latitude political elites have to take like the same event and frame it one way or frame it another. And that would give you guys an opportunity to look at, motivated reasoning, selective perception, and things like that. And it would allow us to get beyond the kind of surface distinction between, yes, people prefer, nonviolent people just sitting there, to people throwing rocks at border police. The last thing I'll say in terms of like a kind of a missed opportunity is, or maybe like a next step is a better way of saying it, is I feel like a lot of this could be about how authority responds, rather than, the kind of protest strategy to begin with. And so I'm not really in the contentious politics literature, I said that already, but like at least canonically, support for the civil rights movement in the North skyrocketed once people started being confronted by imagery of cops beating protesters and hoses and dogs and all that terrible stuff. So it could be that, another dimension of this is not really just like, well, what are the protesters doing? Are they throwing rocks, or are they just sitting there under a bridge? But also like, how are the border police responding to this? And so I feel like your front end kind of made a promise, because it kind of feigned in that direction a little bit and then didn't really follow up with it. So I feel like that's another opportunity for a future study. Now, in terms of the immediate stuff, I'll say one more thing with respect to what you guys could. I really wanted to see more, like the paper's laser focus on the contrast, right? And so was the presentation. And we all know what that contrast is, and it's important, it's useful, but there was very little discussion of whether or not people are generally supportive or not. And whether this varies by geography, predisposition, and all of that stuff. So it's not the most important thing in the paper, but it's really, really important in figuring out what this all means, right? So are we taking a hostile public, like a sort of, basically hostile public, and with this little treatment of this modest treatment effect, making them a little bit less hostile, but still basically hostile? Or are we taking a public that's generally sympathetic, maybe because, well, they're humanitarian concerns, whatever, there are lots of reasons, and taking this positive public and making it a little bit more positive? Or is it, maybe most interestingly, is it a group that's on the cusp, right? Is it like 50-50 in public opinion, and then the choice really matters. So making that like just a descriptive conversation, which is it's right there in your results, right? So just talk about, well, what are the scores on these things, right? Where are the distributions, and like how much, what do those marginal effects really mean in terms of where the sort of masses are? I think that would be really, really important in sort of fleshing this out. Last thing I will say is it's worth considering. This is not really like, this is more like a kind of a tag that you put on the end, but like, if only briefly, just sort of comment on whether or not you think public opinion really moves the needle on this sort of thing. So I am very much interested in what the public thinks. And I am also on the record as saying that public opinion matters in sort of generating or feeding into policy outcomes. But that's a minority view in the literature on people who study like immigration policy making. And like, so for the most part, colleagues of mine who study that sort of thing assume that the policy process is insulated from public opinion, or at most that only very, very small and loud subsections of the population really actually matter to policymakers. And so there's a way to sort of have that conversation a little bit, maybe in reference to your subgroup findings, But I think, the paper would benefit with just a couple of gestures towards like, well, what is, do we really, is our assumption that public opinion really matters here? And if so, what might be the basis of that? All right, so I think I've said enough. So thanks very much again for the opportunity. I look forward to hearing what you guys have to say about it.
Thank you, Matthew. So one of your final points dovetails really nicely with a question that we had in the Q&A from Jez Thurber. So I'm just going to read it so that y'all can engage with all of this kind of collectively. So he said, "This is a very cool study with an important set of findings. Do you have any data on respondents' views on migrants prior to being primed with the vignettes? If I understand correctly, your counterfactual case for the main finding regarding nonviolent tactics is one where migrants engage in violent tactics. Is it possible that engaging in nonviolent contention is actually damaging perception of migrants, but to a lesser degree than violent tactics?" So that I thought went quite well with one of Matthew's final points. So I wanted to sort of slide that in there so y'all could address that in the same vein. So we can now take some time for Daniel and Pearce to respond, ask further questions, etc. And I'll keep monitoring what we have from the audience.
Great, thanks. Daniel, are you good if I start, or what would you like to take anything in particular? Okay, great. Yeah, thank you all for these comments. I'm glad we collected all of them because I definitely see commonalities between them. So I think all three, something we saw in all three comments. I mean, Toby mentioned this, Tamar mentioned this, and then Matthew also mentioned this of this trying to harmonize the connection we're making in the paper with contentious politics. So I think both Tamar and Toby, asked like, what new insights are we gaining by approaching migrants from this lens? It's like we're taking a finding that's been well established in literature on contentious politics, in the last decade, to this setting. And so the real like theoretical purchase in the paper is potentially persuading people that we should be applying this insight to, not only that we should be applying this insight, but that we should expect that the findings from this other literature applies to this setting. And that's where Matthew's comments came in. I think it's especially helpful if like, to what extent, is the migrant encampment an example of contention? And I think there's some additional conceptual lifting to do there. And I think, the McAdam, Terra, and Tilley distinction that we saw, very early in their like 2001 book, they'd say, okay, well, we have, these kind of categories of actors that we might think of as kind of regularized participants in contention, groups that are known to be making claims, against the state or other actors, and that have this kind of established repertoire for making those claims, social movement organizations and the like. But they have this other interesting kind of category that I think we need to unpack more in the paper that would really, I think, expound on this contribution and perhaps answer some of these comments, which is what is transgressive contention, and how do new categories of actors become contentious? It's almost like this growing process of self-awareness, somewhere on the spectrum of, as Matthew's saying, a group of people who happen to be in the same place at the same time, just trying to survive, to people who are, actively asserting some sort of claim and coming to understand themselves as part of this, forging this collective identity. And so I think what we need to emphasize is that, migrants are somewhere on that, at least in the setting that we're studying, that migrants are somewhere along that spectrum. So you might have something like A Day Without Immigrants, as Matthew mentioned, that is very much part of this more regularized contention. You have social movements that advocate for migrants' rights, that are, proposing all of this and using these kind of established repertoires. But you have these, as we've shown kind of in some examples in the paper from Europe. I mean, there's maybe more farther along there, but migrants who have recently, crossed and transited to these European countries that were themselves, as part of the, encampments they were in, making these kinds of claims, holding signs, chanting slogans, but we wouldn't categorize them as that full regularized contention. So I think that's maybe the biggest thing that we need to do is kind of not just assert this and provide some examples, but actually show like what's the conceptual innovation here. And I think that would potentially, or maybe not so much innovation, but how are we bringing back this discussion of emergent contentious actors, and what sort of contribution does that make? So I think that's a great point. And I think that would really boost the theoretical lift of the paper. And I think that also addresses Toby's point about why the border, right, as opposed to things like Matthew, like your paper on the 2006 protests, and it's precisely for this reason, right? It's that these border encounters are becoming kind of the vector of this emergent identity. So the stories we shared even from May of people protesting at U.S. ports of entry on the Mexico side of the border, the groups of migrants that are transiting through Mexico that are sharing that experience for thousands of miles and coming to understand themselves in this way. So yeah, I think that's the biggest thing, hopefully, that we could do to give this paper the bigger theoretical punch, as you all say. Daniel, do you want to add anything on that while
I think that the other point that I really enjoyed hearing and I've been trying to think a little bit more about is really what the theoretical thrust of this paper is and what are we contributing to. And I think that this is something that Pearce and I have been thinking a lot about since we're in the process of writing the conclusion or of rewriting the paper, is why do we find these results, right? And I think that coming from both our work and Tamar, your work as well, there was a sense that the expectation should be that people would treat people of different ethnicities in a different way. And I think that for us, we're still trying to square what it is about this specific context that we're creating here that actually doesn't produce the same set of results. And I think that you hinted at it as well. And I think that that's really something that we should build into the paper a little bit more as well, is the fact that in this basic setup, the category of a migrant, right, from and again, that's why I think initially we had thought that we would see a bigger distinction between destination and transit countries. And so I really appreciate the comment that we should make more of that emphasis as well in the paper. But I think that we were kind of expecting that same dynamic to reoccur. And I think that because in this case, people are observing migrants as perhaps lesser than, right, in terms of the public opinion set of perceptions, then there's not as much variation as we would have expected in terms of the subcategories within this category of migrant that views them as minorities in the first place. And so I think that this is kind of getting at the heterogeneity or the lack of heterogeneity once an actor is framed within this category of minority or weaker actor vis-a-vis the state and their positionality within it. But again, that would make sense. But then when we look at the heterogeneous effects and we look at minority populations within the context of the survey respondents, and we don't really find that set of heterogeneous effects. So I think that there's still a little bit of teasing out on how to place all of this. But I appreciate the comment a lot, and we still need to do a little bit more thinking on where to place this and how to square the empirical findings with the broader set of theories that we're trying to engage.
Matthew, please go ahead, and then we can, if other discussants have other thoughts and questions, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. Just a two-finger on that last point. I think that one of the ways, this is not in, so I live in Vancouver, and one of the ways that I think about this, and this is not in the immigration context, but I think about the downtown East End, which you guys may or may not know about, but there are a lot of people that are in camp there all the time, right? And they're sort of homeless people and whatever, and it's sort of perennial issue. And the way to me, it's not, so two things can be true, right? One, it's uncontroversial that there's variation in the population about how people feel about this, right? Some people feel like it's a human rights violation. Some people feel like it's a crime infested, whatever. And so there's a huge amount of variation there. But at the same time, it would be utterly surprising to me if there was a whole lot of variation in the response to, let's say, experimentally, in the Vancouver public, running a survey and then experimentally assigning, okay, one day they're just sitting there minding their own business, and then the next day, to the treatment group, they're starting to assault police officers, right? So, and it's completely unsurprising to me, or it would be surprising to me if there was some kind of strong variation in the reaction to that treatment, because I think it's well, everybody is going to perceive a greater threat to disorder in one case than in the other, even though people vary wildly on how they approach the scenario to begin with. So that's why I think this just takes me back to the last thing, right? Why that I said, which is why I think it would be useful to contextualize how are the different, what's the average score for various subgroups, and how are people responding to this and whatever, just to contextualize that treatment effect, because moving everybody in the same. It can be true that, like I say, people can vary widely in whether or not they're sympathetic to these people, and they do. I'm sure they do. And the fact that, like, notwithstanding that, pretty much everybody would rather see them just sitting there than seeing them hurl rocks at border police.
Yeah, I can follow. I think this segues nicely into the second kind of set of commonalities in the comments, which is, you know, kind of positioning like, okay, conditional on us doing this theoretical lifting and ensuring that we're really defining these migrants as a category of contentious actor. Then the next question becomes, yes, then okay, well, how are the attitude changes that are resulting from this process different from if there was not contention discussed in the context of migration whatsoever? So this also gets to Chess Thurber's question in the Q&A about you know, kind of effects. Maybe we're looking at prior attitudes, which we do have at least one kind of indicator that we tried to put in to avoid priming people on whether they thought immigration was a salient issue. And then the second point of to what extent do we do the migrants, can we see differences between in terms of the effects among those different groups? So I agree that we missed an opportunity to include this kind of dummy condition. I think Tamar and Matthew both mentioned that. So I think we do have that limitation in not being able to explore this kind of contention, no contention contrast. But I do think we can do more to at least show descriptively, like, you know, what sort of pretreatment attitudes in terms of immigration salience do we have in our samples, and then among those people, maybe what sort of other heterogeneity do we see, and then not just the heterogeneity in effects, but like you know, you all said in comments, the kind of the baseline descriptives. So, you know, are we, Matthew, I think that's an excellent point that helps us queue up to what you're saying about why does public opinion matter. Well, this is a highly polarized issue, and we can show that with our data, and then we're able to say, okay, well, you know, this is the equivalent of, like, you know, the swing voter or something being persuaded. That maybe that would help our case more about the importance of this process. So I think that's the next step I think we need to do descriptively. We also have, I think this is exactly, Tamar had a comment on related to this that I think we're actually already doing. There's an RA who's helping us with this and looking at news reports, but trying to tease apart coverage of this to build up this kind of elite framing story a bit, of saying, okay, well, of the share of media coverage that talks about immigration as this kind of general issue, what share of that is actually describing these kinds of kinetic border encounters? And then, you know, if as we kind of our prior is that share of articles that about immigration that deal with the border itself, the physical border kinetic encounters, is going to increase over time. So we're hoping that can be another kind of piece to bring in this observational data, bring in this larger story about why this experiment's important, right? The experiment can only purchase us so much with the data we have. So how do we bring in other pieces to add to our story? So those are the next steps. Daniel, I don't know if there's more on that point there.
No, I mean, I think the comments have been super helpful, and they're really like pushing us to think in some directions that we still need to continue to develop and work on. So I think that we're achieving the goal of what we sought to do in presenting here today, is getting like just like, I think that in papers like this, when you're trying to pull together different sets of literatures to kind of bring out something new, it's always hard thinking about the reviewer process of the potential pool of reviewers and how to think through each one of the different literatures that we're trying to pull together. So I think that to me was really helpful in the set of comments that we got today, is like starting to bring all of it together, because we've so far been able to present it to one set of audiences or the other, but not in the same room at the same time. So that's really, really helpful for us in terms of how to bring more of the paper together to respond to the different angles that you all are coming from. So I really appreciate it.
Okay, well, we're just about at time. I'm going to take the liberty as organizer to leave one final comment for y'all, just something I was thinking about as I read through. That the other discussants I think already mentioned, but I think, you know, I do not come from the public opinion literature, but I, you know, come from more of the contentious politics and violence literature. And, you know, the strategic component here, I think in this paper, you may have the liberty of just saying that's outside of the scope, But that's of course what I'm wondering about. So just, you're providing this nice rethinking of migrants as a contentious actor. But I truly am still left wondering really under what conditions do they have the luxury of engaging in organized contention. The Border Patrol in your examples is certainly not behaving in kind of a static or typical manner or something that we can predict, right? But in what you're testing, we know very little about what the Border Patrol is doing. We also know very little about what other conditions they have encountered, whether this group has come together very recently, whether this is a group that has been traveling together for some time. I think at some point, I would love to see y'all take this new framing, which I really like, and really engage with when does contention, sort of become an intentional strategy versus something that is purely a response, more kind of based on survival. And unfortunately, I have not left you time to answer that. So maybe just something to consider in addition to the other wonderful things that our discussants have said. This is a truly fantastic paper. I really enjoyed reading it. So thank you to Daniel and Pearce. Thank you to Toby, Tamar, and Matthew. Thank you to all of those who participated. You can find this manuscript on the Peace Science Society website under the Colloquia tab. So if you would like to further engage with it and then send our authors some questions, you should do so. And you can also go back and watch the video if you have missed any part of this presentation. So I will, I think, leave it at that. Jennifer, is there anything else I need to do before ending the meeting, just to be sure?
Nope, all good.
Awesome. Okay. Huge thanks to each of you. Hopefully looking forward to seeing a lot of you in person soon. Bye.
Thank you.